maybe Jocelyn, as we have people coming in, my tip for the early arrivers, because I'm sure you can feel it now. Every time that I run a performance overview session, I always have music playing when people come in, and like fun music, because everyone associates performance reviews potentially with being not as fun. So we go for fun, upbeat music, and it's a good way to get people in that rep mindset, a song that everyone kind of knows and is catchy, and people join in and they're like dancing a little bit. Just kind of what you want, you know what I mean? If you're going to talk about something that isn't everyone's favorite topic, I find that doing even the small things can help people get in a good mood to begin.
Love that. Make as many positive associations as you can.
Are you going to play something?
No, but it would have been a genius move. If I were to play something, I think
you want to know my song of 2020?
I really do.
Sorry to interrupt, but I do. Okay, so don't judge. But it is the Barbie movie song, Dance the Night Away. So you just join in and it's like very dancey. So I opened many meetings of 2023 with that, not gonna lie.
No, I think that's genius. I will always tend towards sort of like a funk, kind of James Brown. My brother's name is James, so it always kind of brings like positive associations. And it's old enough too that you're not alienating anyone by going into 70s funk.
I will say my other one last year for performance reviews was We Will Rock You, which was a good one too. So anything I think that makes people laugh, I think is a good way to start a meeting.
Yeah, the one challenge with the Barbie movie is then it's in your head. I had that in my head for weeks, and now I do again, although it's not a bad thing, for weeks after seeing the movie. It is very catchy.
No, all I can hear is like all these like upbeat songs, like "Hit Me With Your Best Shot." I used to play ice hockey, so that was like our warm up.
Yeah, also another really good one. Yeah,
I think that's brilliant.
I had to update to more current music because last year I got to one of our VPs made fun of me, and he was like, "Vanesa, like, what is up? There's never any current hits." So I was like, "Okay, 2023 will be the year of better music choices."
Love that. Yeah, I try to go really old because I can't even guess what the current hit would be. With no real radio play, and you never know what's going on. I'd have to ask somebody else. I do like that idea. You often get the walk-on music when you're speaking events. I should make that a practice here. So tips for those running performance review training and for those of us running webinars need some upbeat starting music. Okay, so I think since we're about 2 minutes after the hour, we'll get started. So if our producer just wants to share those poll results. Okay, so we got sort of a 50-50 split of folks who run the performance program at their company, and those are managers who are showing up to write them. So good news is we have been talking about sort of both topics. We also have experts who can share on those. So without further ado, welcome to the webinar. Thank you for attending. This will be a fairly informal conversation. We do have some prepared questions. But the intent really is to share our expertise, take your questions as we go through this. And really what we tried to do was bring together a couple of unique perspectives, but all towards the benefit of actually making performance reviews the best thing you do all year. Let's take away the sort of stigma of the drudgery, and let's talk about how you can control that conversation to make it an amazing experience for yourself, for your employee, or for all of the employees that you are working with. So I'm going to start by letting the panelists introduce themselves, and then we'll get into sort of the core set of content. I think you're up first, Lindsey.
Oh, great. Okay. Well, first of all, I just want to thank everybody for being here and carving out the time to commit to this and to show up and to learn how you can make that performance review as meaningful as possible. So first of all, just like hats off to everyone that's here and thank you. My name is Lindsey Nehls. I'm a co-founder of Elevate Leadership. And prior to founding Elevate, I was an executive at Fortune 50 companies. So I did a lot of performance reviews, and I helped scale and I helped grow company, divisions. And and ran turnarounds and so on and so forth. And one of the things that I just like learned time and time again was who you work for is everything. It determines, how you feel about your job, how you feel about yourself, how you feel about going home. And I sort of left that track and founded Elevate with Lucy Georgiadis, my work wife, who I adore, with the mission and the passion to really help managers be the kind of manager that they want to work for, because we believe management is learned. And so I'm thrilled to talk about this topic today because I think that this is a moment that matters. It matters how you show up. The conversation matters. There's emotions at play. So we are all about just helping you and rooting for you and just helping you set up for success in a really practical and actionable way. So
that's awesome. Thanks, Lindsey. And we likewise, I share a similar passion for managers. So my name is Jocelyn Brown. I'm the head of SES and sales at Hypercontext, which is a platform used by thousands of managers to run their one-on-ones, because that performance management isn't a season. It's actually happening all the time. And so you want to have those habits that you use week in, week out to move forward. So our platform helps with the one-on-ones, helps you drive really effective meetings so that you're driving that high-performing team, manage your goals and OKRs so that you can get those great outcomes, and then ultimately have performance reviews that are AI assisted so they're less effort with a higher impact. We want managers to have the best opportunity to be that boss that Lindsey just described, to make that difference in somebody's life and to help their companies actually unlock that incredible potential that's in their entire employee base. So I feel passionate about this topic, and I've also been fortunate to manage many go-to-market teams, as well as experience having exceptional managers myself. So everything we can do to help managers do their best work that lets their people do their best work. And both of us have the fortune to work with Vanesa as well. So I'll let Vanesa introduce herself.
Awesome. Thank you so much. It's so nice to hear both of your intros. Yeah, I was going to say I am fortunate to work with both Lindsey and Jocelyn in different capacities as two of my partners. I'm Vanesa. I'm the VP of People and Culture at PolicyMe. A little bit different than Lindsey and Jocelyn because they build awesome tools that help people like us, like many of the people on the call. I live the day-to-day, so I think today is going to be super interesting because you get all the different perspectives from each of us on things we've learned, things we see. And in terms of me and why I'm here today, I think that performance reviews are just like such an excellent time to reflect. And we'll go into it more in terms of our philosophy and how we look at these things. But in terms of my day-to-day at PolicyMe, I do everything that I can to ensure that we're putting feedback into our day-to-day. And it's super important to build a culture where this is something that happens regularly. And I'm just really excited to share some of the things that we do with all of you, but also to talk about it in terms of tactically, how do we go about the day-to-day? If you have any questions, we just launched our performance review process as well. Happy to tell you about the learnings from, the years of PolicyMe and prior companies as well. What worked, what didn't. I worked at companies of many different sizes. I used to work at Deloitte, which is massive. I worked at a little bit of a bigger tech company, and now PolicyMe, we're about 65 employees. So, big range. So for those that are on the line, and we saw a little bit of the preview of who's going to be here today. Lots to share in terms of how to do this for smaller teams, bigger teams, and any of those takeaways. But just, really, really excited to have this conversation, to see what questions you have. And I know it's going to be an awesome discussion.
That's great. So I think the best place to start, I think, Vanesa, you kind of brought it up, but the first place to start is maybe what is your philosophy around performance reviews? And in your case, you actually sort of set the tone and set that kind of intention for the team at PolicyMe. So maybe share a little bit about the way you see performance reviews.
Yeah, 100%. I think what's interesting is there's this notion that performance reviews are the time to give feedback. And as much as they are a great opportunity to reflect, I think that if performance reviews are the moments where you're giving that net new feedback, you're probably not doing a service to yourself or your direct reports, or if you're the HR person managing the process for your organization, you're not really doing the best service for your employees. And I'd love to share a little bit more as to why. So I think performance reviews have a lot of stress associated with them, right? I think that's why most of you are probably on this call. It's this time of the year where if you're a manager, you're like, oh, I'm trying to wrap up the year. Or if you do them mid-year too, it's so much going on. And now on top of it, it's performance reviews. And I have to tell my people what they're not doing well. And then my people are getting emotional. And we're going to talk about all these things today, but it's just like this stress that goes on for managers. And one of the things that I really focus on as the leader of the people side of things within a company is how do we remove that stress, right? For managers, for employees. And one of the things that I've found to be the best thing to do is create a culture where feedback is given regularly. And I say to all our employees, all our managers, if at the time of performance reviews, you're either about to give a piece of feedback you've never given before, or if you receive a piece of feedback you had no idea about, reach out to me. And I say that just to level set on the fact that this is really not the time for net new information. This is time to reflect, to sit together and think about what are all the things we did the last 6 to 12 months together, depending if you do it once or twice a year. What are the areas where we're doing awesome? What are the things that we want to keep working on? And then coming out of performance reviews, you set plans that help you achieve those goals that you want. I think it's just framing that mentality to these are our moments to meaningfully reflect, check in, make sure we're taking inventory of all that we've done, where we can still grow for sure, but in a more positive and reflective way. So my biggest thing on the philosophy side of it is this really should be a time for reflection, not net new information.
Yeah, I like that concept of really anchoring it in this really should be nothing new. If you've been doing the one-on-ones well, we often say then the reviews should write themselves. And in our case, we're trying to make that true. For me, I look at that as very much you said, it's more of a process enabler. So you want to enable the process of reflecting. So as opposed to means and like an ends into itself, like a whole stressful big anchor to the year, it's just another enabler, process enabler to give you the time and space to reflect and make a plan. And that it's timed so that you can do that, so that you can continue to achieve, so that you don't go down the wrong path for too long. Like lots of things we do in business with goals and other things, a lot of it's about making sure we're all staying on the same track and staying within those expectations. So I try to lighten it as much as I can to say this is a process enabler to make sure that this conversation happens. And that's all it is. It's not this heavy, scary thing. And then there's lots of things, and we'll talk a lot about the preparation and kind of running the meeting, but like, how can we make it a good experience, an easy experience? So Lindsey, I'll turn it to you in case for your sort of philosophy on this. We've maybe covered a lot of it.
Yeah, I think you have. Yeah, plus one. But the only thing I would add to what you're saying is just that it is, I think the sort of beauty of performance reviews is just that it is the opportunity to reflect, right? Just as you've said. And we'll talk about like when that reflection happens and the power of preparation. But I think of it as this moment because, hopefully you have been giving feedback in your one-on-ones and everything. So now, you've had a lot of conversations, right? You're doing that along the way. But then there's this moment in time where you get to distill it. And just that process of distilling that feedback can really create a lot of clarity. And also just that, to be able to take a whole bunch of themes and really sort of like, I always think in the prep too, it's like, well, what do I really want them to know? Like if they walk away with, one thing, what is that? And I just think that moment in time to be able to ask that, right? Like, what is the one thing? If I were to distill this down, like, what is it really? I think is a really, an important moment and a very productive one. And so I think that's like one of my favorite things about having to give them. And also just the moment, like what the potential that the moment holds, I guess, right?
Yep.
Yeah.
And that it's dedicated. It's dedicated to that person. It's dedicated to their opportunities and their improvement. So I think all of us have touched on preparation. So clearly we're all big believers that the preparation you put into these are how you're going to get there. But I think that in some ways is what inspires some dread. The amount of time, the amount of effort. I think some of it's, reinforcing how much value there is in that and how much leverage and power there is in doing that really well. But I think let's talk a little more practically about the preparation. I think we have a poll too, just around the prep work that we can just put up quickly. But I think I'd love to get sort of a sense from you, Vanesa, on how you've already emphasized how building a culture of feedback and that this is continuous is there. But what are kind of the practical advice that you're trying to give folks? What are some of the traps you're trying to avoid? I think we had a bit of a conversation about, biases that might come in. So what are you teaching your folks about how they prepare for these meetings?
Yeah, happy to share. I think what's interesting is when we think about preparation, I saw we have about half the people attending that are people like me, you know what I mean? So when we think about preparation, it's like, I think first, how do you prepare as an HR leader for it? And second, how do you prepare your people, right? So I think maybe I'll touch on the first one first, just given the nature of the audience in terms of like the HR team and the preparation for people and culture team and those sorts of things. And then I'll move a little bit more, Jocelyn, into some of the things that I know we discussed in terms of the manager things that I share, and keep me honest if I forget to do one or the other. So in terms of what I would say, I think we have a lot of people on the line that you're not part of big HR teams, right? Someone on my team is on this call too. She told me she was joining. We're a tiny team, right? And a lot of us are tiny teams, and being a tiny team means that preparation is key because there are so many things that you do in your day-to-day. And we too, as the people and culture leaders and HR professionals, get oh no, performance reviews are coming up. And like, it's this really big thing we have to run, at least once a year, and we do them twice. So in terms of preparation, what I always do in advance is when the last cycle ends, the new cycle begins. That's really how it works for me every time. And what I mean by that is at the end of a cycle, and I'll start with there because it really feeds into the beginning of the next, I ask every single manager and every executive, and I send them a direct message on Slack because I found this to be the most effective. Do you have any feedback for me about the performance review process? Here's 3 questions I have. Feel free to answer 1, 2, 3, or nothing. And every cycle, I get a little bit more feedback. And what that does is that is my starting point into the new cycle. So a couple examples of feedback that I've received and things that I've incorporated over the years. So for example, some feedback on the questions we asked. I remember about 2 years ago, a little bit longer now, when we did our first one at PolicyMe, our first big proper one, there was one question, there's that typical model that stop, start, continue. And there was, people were finding some overlap in what they were answering. And they were like, hey, I don't think this is really helping me. Is there any way we can make this simpler? So for peer and upward feedback for reviews, we only have 2 questions now. It's, if you're reflecting on your peers, it's what is 1 or 2 things this person has done awesome, and what's one thing they could maybe work a little bit on. And that's it. That's all we ask for peer and upwards. We really focused on simplifying the questions as much as possible and turning that into part of our cycle. So starting point for performance review cycle, feedback from last performance review cycle. And I leave myself a document, and as I open to start to prepare for the next one, that's the first thing I look to check, the things that I need to set up differently this time around. Any feedback on like timelines, this thing was too short, this thing was too long, can we do this slightly differently? I go through all of that and then rethink the schedule. And I really do put together a big schedule. It's like, when do I need to have XYZ ready? Everything from, who's potentially up for promotion, who do we need to look at in different ways, compensation reviews, all of those things are part of this timeline that I have on the back end. Who do I need to be engaging for what? Our executive team, VP, the managers. All of these things exist in this framework that lives behind the scenes. And then comes the first outward facing, which is, when am I running the performance review overview? And that really is a session to kick things off, explain the timelines, explain what's going to happen. What is peer feedback? Some people, it's their first job out of school. It's their first time doing a performance review, right? I have someone that actually reached out to me this week. I did this big conversation last week, and they're like, hey, it's my first time ever doing this. I don't really know what a self-reflection is. And they hadn't launched yet. And I said, no worries at all. Just like wait until the 6th. They'll open up. If you take a look, have any questions, reach out to me by Friday. And, I think that's the thing. It's that empathy of remembering, like for us, it may feel like something we've done a million times. For some people, it's very literally their first. So from that pre-work, that first conversation for the whole company, and then I send out a timeline. This is exactly what you can expect. This is how long things are open for. This is what it looks like. This is how you do the things. I will say, we do training through Elevate with Lindsey on how to give feedback. I ran a session on Friday as well. We've done training for all of our managers on how to give performance reviews also through Elevate. And it just helps empower people to kind of know how to have the conversation. So in that HR side of things, the best thing to do is like really think about your next process after the end of the last one. Really think about everything you have to do versus like what's actually outward facing. Make sure you're giving yourself enough space. My last tip, always, both for performance reviews and engagement surveys, say it closes on a day. It never does. Like, this is a bad thing to say if we have any managers, but like, I think they now kind of know that I'm like, this is all due December 22nd. But because I had some questions of like, well, what if I'm working and I want to do it over the holidays? I was like, yeah, it's going to be fine. But, you know, I think it's having those extra days of slack. The first time I ever ran a performance review process, I put in no slack. Learn from my mistakes. That was horrible. What it led to was me a full like 24 hours awake, try to phase this whole thing together of like, I'm still missing this one. And if I give them 3 more hours, it's horrible. Always add slack. So I would say I'm talking a lot, but that's on the HR side of things. And I know Lindsey has some incredible resources to share on the manager side of things and preparation, but maybe one tidbit there before I pass it on to Lindsey that we had discussed in advance of preparing for today. One of the questions I get a lot from managers is, you know, I struggle because someone may have had amazing performance, but then something kind of happened in the last few weeks and I'm not sure how to incorporate that all in the performance review. Or the flip side, someone hadn't really been doing that great. Maybe they did go on an improvement plan and they've improved a ton, or they weren't doing that great when they first started, but now they've been with us a bit longer and they're doing amazing. So a lot of this, like, how do we do a really good performance review when someone's performance hasn't been consistent is a very, very common question. So what I would say is when you're thinking about this in terms of like looking at what's happened very recently versus what's happened kind of like over this longer time frame, my recommendation would be it really is about looking at the entire picture. It can be so easy to get caught up in like, in the last 6 weeks, I noticed X, Y, Z, but it's not meant to be 6 weeks, right? And my best tip so that you don't get stuck in that is take notes along the way. I know Jocelyn Hypercontext offers some amazing products to make sure that, you know, you're keeping track of things over time. However, you do this for yourself, be it like a very simple OneNote that when you're doing your one-on-ones, you make note of the things. Or, you know, if you're sending little feedback cards or having feedback conversations, I know it's simple to say, but taking notes throughout the year is what helps you and what makes you win in these critical moments that can have such meaningful impact. And I always say, if you've seen a big change in the last 6 weeks, in the last 2 months, of course, talk about it. But that's not the only thing that has happened. Right? So talk about it in the context of that change that you've seen, that progression, and how you're looking for that to continue. Or if things have not gone as well the last couple of months, just talk about how great things were going before, or your expectations, where you've noticed a bit of a downward trend that you'd like to bring right back up. So it really is about that entire time frame. And I always say to my managers, do not just focus on the last couple of months.
Which is probably that recency bias is the toughest thing to try and actually get rid of, and the only way to do it is to have those notes and prepare them. I think you said a couple things in there that, Lindsey, I'd love to hear about. One, you sort of talked about, see, look at that. This is how people are preparing for it. Yeah, exactly as we said, they're reviewing their past notes. They spend more time trying to remember what happened 6 months ago. Save yourself the trouble.
Yeah. And yeah, it's such a thing, right? Like trying to remember what happened 6 months ago. And it happens to all of us. I will say just personally how I keep track of my life. I don't know if this is helpful for anyone else, but I've said this to many people. Someone taught me this when I first started working years ago. And this is probably an antiquated method now because there's much better tools than what I do, but it really works for me. Thankfully, I moved out of this because it was a lot of beast to carry, but I still have one every year. But I have this master OneNote and it's literally open next to me. And basically I make a new page for every day with all my to-dos. And then I create new pages below that with the things that happened that day. But I literally have next to me, if I look back, I can go back since I've started at PolicyMe, I have this. So if I want to look at, August 25th, I can go back and be like, all right, August 25th, these are the things that happened that day. And anything important would be a page below it. So any of those things, if I want to put feedback on X, I'll just have all those things and they'll say feedback. So I can just search feedback and a bunch of things come up. So I think whatever way you take notes, whatever way you stay organized, just some way that you can time box and look back through your notes is so, so helpful at the time of performance reviews.
Yeah. So that recency bias is one piece of the equation. I think you also brought up that you're collecting peer and upward feedback. Can't recommend that enough because your own bias, your own view is just too limited. So any way you can make sure you're getting that. Lindsey, you spoke a little bit about really trying to understand underlying causes. And I think when you've had inconsistency in performance, that's maybe one of the most important things. So can you maybe talk a little bit about that in the preparation, how you do that, how you kind of uncover that?
Yeah, you bet. Yeah. So, yeah, it was interesting too to see that poll, right? Like, I think one of the benefits of a performance review, that moment in time, is often you are getting a lot more feedback than maybe you normally would, or please do that, right? Like it is that feedback, right? And just upward feedback and all of that. And then you're trying to make sense of it all, right? And sometimes it can be inconsistent too. Peers are saying one thing, your experience is another, right? And so I think also, when you're preparing, right, we want to look at themes. We've got a lot of data, and then we're trying to step back and say, like, are there themes? Are there patterns? And often when there are themes and patterns, one of the things that's really important, I think, to ask yourself is, like, what is a symptom and what is an underlying cause? So one of my favorite analogies, which you'll see in our How to Give, Vanesa's very familiar with that because we talk about this when we how to give feedback, right? So if you think of an iceberg, what is above the line, right, above the water, right, is what we see. It's what we observe. It's what the feedback we're getting from the peer reviews, upward feedback, right? Those, by definition, they're often symptoms. So maybe it's someone like, that performance, Vanesa, they were talking about, right? Like they started off slow, they did really well, they're back lacking a little bit, or those often it's what we're observing, right? Like someone not speaking up or engaged or not showing up to a meeting on time, or that those are all symptoms. And the key is to understand what actually is causing those, what's below the surface. And the reason why that's so important is because if we try to solve symptoms, it doesn't work. We'll end up in the same place and we'll be like, why aren't they changing, right? And so you've got to get to the root cause. You've got to get below the surface. And this is where, again, the performance reviews are meant to be a conversation, right? I think, Jocelyn, you brought up about like the opportunity for alignment around things. And so you're not to solve. You can't get under the surface. Like you are not them. You do not know their experience. You do not know what's going on in their life. So the key is to present the facts. Present the fact that, like, so interesting. In the first month of the quarter, we saw this, whatever that is, right? In the second month, right? Is so this is, my, and then you can share like what the implication of that or what your perspective is. But the key is you need to ask them, and you need to create the space for them to help you understand, like, what is coming up? Like, how, can you help me understand this? What's going on? What, from your perspective, right? Get under the surface and find out what that root cause is, and then together come up with a solution for that root cause. Otherwise, a lot of time will get wasted. So my kind of ELDR is get below the surface, have the conversation.
Well, I think what you're emphasizing, which I think we all believe, is that actually the conversation after the review's been produced is the most valuable piece of this exercise. And I think to some degree, the weight of preparing that is what makes the whole process seem so arduous and so difficult. A lot of what we look at is trying to make that first step the easiest part of the process, the synthesizing of all the notes, the inputs, and otherwise using AI to do that, just to make that process really simple so that you can spend your time on exactly what you're describing, Lindsey, in the synthesis, in the root cause. And I think that coaching to managers that Vanesa is giving through the training at Elevate or otherwise of how to have that conversation and deliver it, that's where the effort, the energy, the value really is going to come in, is in that conversation. And that's why I always think of it as it's really just a process enabler. Because you're trying to drive towards the ability to have that conversation. And what I love about what you highlight there, Lindsey, is that going into that conversation, you want to be clear on the facts and clear on what you're trying to uncover, but it's not the end state, right? That's an entry point into the conversation, and then staying curious. So you probably in your preparation are going to come up with more questions. The performance review is not an answer to some existential question. It is the springboard for a high value conversation. So I think let's move on to kind of leading the conversation. Again, we had another poll, just how are you showing up to these? So I think we spent a lot of time about getting the review done, but then how you are actually showing up to that conversation is really important. And in the prep, I was laughing because Lindsey and I took the same question and thought about it like 1000% differently, where I was like, yeah, before the conversation, take a deep breath, go for a walk, change your location. Lindsey had come at it in what is probably a much more complete and practical way of doing it. But those tips are real too. You should not be sliding meeting to meeting for these. These are a big investment of everybody. The person you're talking to is more than likely a bit anxious about this as well. So do think about getting your person ready for that, and breathing, walking around, those simple things to calm down your parasympathetic nerves, all that good stuff. Do that. But I think having a plan is probably also the thing that's going to help you be the most calm. And I think if we'll get the answer to that survey, Lindsey, you guys actually have a framework for this on how to actually run the conversation. And unfortunately, too few of us. Look at that. More people than I would have expected actually have that framework. So that's great. So having a plan is what's going to make that conversation go really well. So do you want to share with folks a little bit about how to lead that conversation?
Absolutely. Yeah. So I'm so glad that so many people have a framework. So that's excellent. So I'll go through that quickly because it sounds like the audience really has that. I would say, so the way I think about the conversation is in 4 parts. So one is the agenda, like setting the table for it, right? And of course, first you want to just check in, say hello. But then in that agenda piece, I find it really helpful to you want to come in and set a positive tone, right? So you've also got to come in with positive energy. So the first thing is just summarizing like one summary comment that is positive, right? So like, I can really tell that over the past 6 months, you have been working incredibly hard to action the feedback we've been talking about. It is so great. Or, I can see that this new role is like, you just light up. Like, this is something you're deeply passionate about. You're really stepping up, but just like one summary, reflective comment that's positive. And then you want to give them the arc of the conversation, right? So I thought today, what I would love to do is first I want to share and reflect and just celebrate and share some of the really positive things I've seen. So first part is positive. That's really important. We want to first do the positive. Then you want to say, I want to really share. Then you get into the constructive. So I want to share, I want to look at like some feedback to help you continue to grow that we can work on over the next 6 months. And then I want to make sure we design a follow-up. Even if we don't get it today, let's make sure that like we're going to create time to set up a game plan to continue to grow in the ways that we both are motivated to do so, or what have you, right? So it's step number 1 is the agenda, lay out the agenda. Step number 2 is you're going to go into that positive feedback. The positive feedback is first. When you share the positive feedback, just a note on that, really make sure that you're focusing on the behaviors, not just the outcomes. People want to do well. They inherently do. And so you want to set them up for success to do that. And of course, you want to celebrate. Like these are, probably 6 months, maybe a year's worth of work, right? The key though, when you're doing that is you want to share the behavior. When I say that, I mean like some words for behavior might be effort, creativity, persistence. Like what, if you think about it, like what is it that they're doing that they're in control of that is driving those really successful outcomes? And that's the point in addition to like, you want to share the impact, right? Like way to, like exceed plan or whatever that is. But it's what was it? What was it? Your tenacity? Like I really, because we want to give them, those are the keys to the kingdom in terms of like, they then know that, okay, if I keep doing that thing, if I keep operating in that way, I'll continue to be successful. That's like the recipe. It's the ingredients, right? So praise goes first, and you want to make sure that you are highlighting the behavior, not just the outcome. Then step number 3 is the constructive feedback. And this is where we want to make sure we're presenting the facts and having a dialogue around it. Questions you can ask to create that dialogue, right? Or just even like, I've shared a lot of feedback. What are your thoughts on the feedback I just shared? How do you feel about what I just shared? Does anything surprise you? Like, what's your perspective, right? You want to start to engage in that conversation. What trends do you see? What do you think's underlying them? And then the last part, section 4, is that follow-up. So you might not get to that follow-up in the moment, right? Like in that time might not allow, what have you. The key though is just to make sure that like you talk about like, okay, how do we want to design our development plan? And your company might have this and all that, but just making sure that you have a game plan, or you're talking about how you're going to then action and continue to do the things that are going really well. And how do you grow to build the skills that they need to in order to continue to be successful?
I think that's awesome. Just even to have a plan. All meetings need agendas in my opinion, but to have a plan for that one is particularly important. We're getting a bunch of questions. Some of them are very specific for Vanesa, and I will get to them. One specific to this one, Lindsey, and Vanesa, both of you actually, but who are you finding needs the most training on this? Because I think that might be the other thing that everybody skips. One, Vanessa, you brought it up, it might be somebody's first job, but I don't know that in my whole career I've ever been trained specifically on performance reviews. I've been trained on feedback conversations. I think that was probably later in my career. I think we probably prepare our managers for these moments, these really actually high impact moments. But when you think about performance conversations specifically, like Lindsey, who's the audience that you find need the most training or that you do the most work with?
That's a great question. I mean, what we really try to meet leaders where they are, managers where they are, and get them where they want to go. But we do try to create, like, I know Vanessa is a huge person, like a proponent of creating culture, and I think that like a culture is created when one of the ways to create culture, right, is to when everyone like speaks the same language, right? Because it reinforces itself. So I actually really encourage that. And we do this, what we do. We train at every level in the organization. Now, like the framework probably won't change. The nuances, like the examples, that's going to change depending on the level they're at, right? And there's a depth you can go to. But I do really think there's power when you have like company processes like this where everyone's going through a certain experience, right? Often I find companies have this scaffolding, if you will, which is great, even to have that, like a hypercontext, right? Like that's so huge, but it's also like, well, how are we all having these conversations?
Yeah.
So I would say, like, I really do think it is very helpful to be able to have this training at every level. You just need to make sure it's relevant at that level, of course. And I think that's one of the reasons we have like live workshops, and we also have micro-learning, and companies can even use the micro-learning like Vanesa's doing to train internally just to make it super scalable. And then the last point I would say in terms of like I do think there's something to like, it is hard to know, like if you've never done a performance review, that is hard. Like that is really helpful to have a framework, right? And most of you do, which is awesome. So, and also just how do you prepare? Like how do you manage emotions that are may come up, right? So I just think we can make this easier on people when we can help them, just when we give them the tools to be able to handle situations that we're all going to need an arc for the conversations. Emotions will come up, right? And so if we can just set them up in the preparation for success, they have something to go to, they're going to be that much more effective, and they want to be. So
yeah, maybe a couple of things to add there. I agree with Lindsey. I mean, ideally training everyone, and it's what we've worked on over the last while, and some people get more training than others. But I would say if you have limited time and resources, the place to start is managers. Always focus on your managers first. They're the ones delivering the conversation. And that means anyone that is a manager. So that could be an executive that is not great at it. That could be like managers that have one direct report. Literally anyone that is going to actually be running the conversations are the people that need the training the most. Because if you train them well, the people receiving it will have a better experience, right? So as much as we want to train also people receiving the conversation on how to ask questions, how to make their most of their own personal experience, if the giver or like the person that holds the space is not well equipped to hold that space, regardless if the other person is well trained or not, it tends to fall apart, in my opinion. I did just want to highlight something. So over the years of training managers and talking with different managers and the things that have come up during or after, the biggest thing that I've learned that matters to say is when you train managers, on top of all the things that Lindsey said and these amazing conversations and structures for, how you run a performance review conversation, it is so important to tell managers that it's okay to tell their direct reports that they don't have the answers to their direct reports questions. So number one thing that happens in a performance review conversation, direct report then asks, well, what about my compensation increase? I thought it would be X, Y, or Z. Or in the case that they weren't sure they were going to get this feedback, and they say like, well, but I thought we discussed this 3 months ago and then again 2 months ago. Why are we discussing it again as part of my performance review? I thought we were over this, right? Like there's been so many moments, as much as you can have like an amazing company, an amazing culture, where some employee receiving their performance review gets defensive, which is totally normal and okay. Regardless of how well you train your managers, your employees can happen. Then the manager in that moment has a moment of panic and word vomits, something that then is so hard to help them peel back. So my number one thing that I say to managers is if you get asked something that you don't expect or you don't know the answer to, do not feel like you need to respond. Just say, thank you so much for bringing that up. That's a really great question. I'm going to look into it and get back to you. Or I really appreciate you sharing that feedback. Why don't you give me a couple of days to process, and then we'll have a follow-up conversation. the best tool to give managers is like it's okay if you don't have all the answers, especially for first-time managers, because then what they do, they come to me and they're like, hey, Vanesa, my direct report asked like this one really nuanced specific thing. Can you help me answer it? 100%. Like, let's think about it. Let's discuss. Let's see how we want to do this. Or another really typical one, in case you've experienced this, is like a direct report will say to their manager, you know, maybe they're in sales and they're like, I decided I want to be a product manager. And then their manager didn't know. This is the first time they're hearing about it. And they're like, yeah, for sure. Like, let's see what we can do to start to get you trained up so we can move you into that part of the business. All the while, like, there's plans as a business. There may not be a need for a new product manager for X amount of time. That person may not have the right skill set. There may be a ton of other things that need to be thought out. So anyways, so many different examples where that used to come up. So the more you inform your managers of, if you don't know something, just say you don't know, right? Like, I will follow up. Thank you so much. Like, you don't have to say, I don't know. Just like that acknowledgement and that you're going to look into it is the really, really best response for those moments.
That opens up 100 avenues of conversation, but just looking at some of the questions to make sure we're getting that in there as well. I think you brought up another thing that I think puts so much weight onto that conversation. If they think it's the only time that they're ever going to be able to talk about feedback, or the only time they're ever going to be able to ask about compensation or any of those other big things that weigh on people, one, if it's too tied and that is the only time they can influence it, that's going to cause issues. But even if it's not, even if your company, and I've had this at many companies, the compensation and the performance are not tied in terms of timing for very specific reasons. And certainly I like the idea of that. But regardless of that, it's still going to come up. They're still going to worry about that. And you brought that up there, where if you don't have the answer, first of all, giving your managers permission to say, I don't have the answer, and that it's not expected in that moment, in that performance review, that performance review is really a different exercise, but an important one to get the feedback that that's part of the expectation. But how do you even think about or help managers understand kind of the balance between how much of this is about opportunity to plan and reflect, and how much of this is input into other processes like compensation, like promotions and things like that? I think everybody's got it so tied up into one thing, and it's the only time they can do anything about anything, that helping people understand, that they're two processes, but like, how do you do that? Because it's all going to come up in one moment. Actually, either of you can answer that, but Vanesa brought it out.
Sure. I'm happy to share how we do it. I think it's super interesting because, Jocelyn, to your point, I've seen it decoupled and work really, really well decoupled. Yeah. I've seen it decoupled. And then if some people feel that the performance review is not tied to compensation, then it's like that, it's just like whatever, I'll look into more when we're doing whatever it is tied to compensation. So what we landed on, and I always say these things are iterative. We're not perfect either by any means. It's just what, my experience has shown me can work. And I always say it's what's working for me now. Come to me in 2 years, I may be doing it differently. So I always say, things change, and they should in the people space. They definitely have, especially over the last 5-10 years. We didn't have AI helping us write our performance reviews, right, Jocelyn? So, it's a whole new world. But what we do is we actually do performance reviews twice a year. And basically, there's some timelines of if you started before this date or whatever that looks like, you're in or you're not in yet. But if, assuming you've been with us for a while, twice a year. And one of those is also your compensation review. Now, how it works is that based on your start date, you're either in the winter compensation cycle or the summer compensation cycle. It's also really good for business planning. So if you are doing any budgeting exercises, or you're trying to figure out like how to smooth some of these things, if you're working closely with your finance teams, kind of like a good way to not have all these increases at once. So something to think about from a business standpoint. But the nice thing about it is I look at compensation data for everyone twice a year. Although you're only up for compensation review once a year, if I see that there's any big changes in the market, in your role or in your field, and for some reason you're now underpaid, we will adjust you then, right? Like, we're checking every 6 months. This is not like, if you're not getting paid what you should be paid, we're going to wait another 6 months for no reason. So it's that feeling of everyone is getting looked at twice a year, but your moment for that increase is annual. And what we've done is if there's ever, someone that has shown exceptional performance, right? And you're like, oh my goodness, this person, we hired them, they knocked it out of the park, or like they moved into a new role and they're doing amazing. In those exceptional moments, we have actually moved it earlier, right? And we moved it into that other performance review cycle. So what it does is, because everyone is looked at twice, there's this feeling of like, yeah, we're looking at my performance twice a year, compensation is once a year, but people know that they matter because they are being looked at as an input into, does anything need to change sooner? I know that there's philosophy too around like the rationale for decoupling it, which I also really like. When I tried to implement it, I found that there were some difficulties, and it depends on the environment.
Totally.
So I think there's different ways that can work for different companies.
I think probably the most valuable way that part of how you've set that up is the transparency and the predictability for the people, in that they know that twice a year, this thing that makes them anxious or that's hard for them to talk about is being evaluated, and that it's okay to talk about it, to care about it, to push it. And likewise for the managers that have people that are asking for promotion every 2 months, they also have a deferral mechanism. So I think no matter what, being clear about what the performance data is being used for, and being clear about how they can ask for or get information about the other parts of the process that are involved is what's really going to help you out. I did want to...
Sorry, can I say one last thing? I do think just something to keep in mind is you just triggered when you mentioned someone that asks for a promotion every 2 months, those sorts of things. I think the reason to have timelines and to have people looked at together is because some people are more vocal than others, and being vocal does not mean you're the best performer. No. And I think from an equity standpoint and doing the right thing and the kind thing and looking at all your employees based on how they're doing, not who's the loudest, you need to do this holistically, right? Yeah. Like it's not an indicator that someone's the best performer in your company if they're just telling you they need a promotion.
For sure. And I think actually that kind of takes us nicely into the managing emotions, because I think that everybody shows up to these with very different experiences from their past life, and they're carrying a lot of baggage, and they're carrying potentially fear. As a manager, you may not be comfortable with confrontation, and you may have people in your team that are like that, or vice versa. So I think even if you have the most positive relationship in the world, things can come up. And even though we all promote that this should never be the first time that you're hearing some feedback or discussing this, you still need to be prepared for that. And I think, Lindsey, you had some sort of good feedback on how to think about being ready to manage those emotions, and how you can be intentional about how you approach this so that you are using that moment well, and you're not kind of wasting it or getting caught off guard. And I think that's an important thing for people to think about. So if you could share maybe a little bit about how to be ready to catch that emotion should it come.
Yeah, absolutely. So I also just want to plus one what Vanesa said. It is okay to not have the answers. It is really okay. It is better just to say, I hear you and thank you, and I will get back to you. Make sure you get back to them, obviously. But that's just so great. So you don't have to all of the answers. One of the things, though, that of course you want to be able to do is you want to be able to be there for someone, right? Like emotions are at play, and you're good. So one, try to anticipate it, but when it comes up, I want to make sure that you feel like you have something to go to and to lean on, because otherwise we're so we're so used to solving things, right? Like that's what we it's what we're rewarded for, and solving in the moment doesn't always help. And so what I would say is empathy. When emotions come up, empathy is your best friend. And when I say empathy, what I don't mean is sympathy or relating. So that means when we tell a story, right? We're like, oh my gosh, I know this happened to me too. That is actually really not helpful. We want to really make sure that they feel seen, they feel heard, and empathy is how you do that. If empathy is not something that you feel like, oh, I know exactly how to do that and I'm really empathetic, here's a great, just real quick 4-point structure. you can see I love a good 4-point structure, is like how to be empathetic. So the first thing is like empathy is about walking in someone's shoes, right? And so a key to that is like what you want to do is state the truth. Feelings are real. So there's got to be something that's really true. Like if you truly were in those shoes and their feelings are real, right? Then what is true about what they just said? So it could be like, yeah, it is really hard when you feel like you're getting feedback for the first time in a performance review. That is hard, right? That, like, you're just stating the truth, right? It is really hard to feel like you really want to be promoted and there isn't room in the business. That is a true statement, right? It sucks. It is hard, right? You're not saying it's so just state the truth. That's point one in the structure, in the 4-point framework, if you will. The second one is just, it's helpful sometimes just briefly summarize like what they said. So just so they, again, like one, you're understanding it correctly. And two, just again, you're showing them that you feel them, they feel heard. So it's like a quick summary of what they've said. Then you might also, point 3 in the structure is just observing their feelings, right? It's like, I can tell you're really upset by this. I can tell that this is getting you very frustrated, or I can tell you're really sad. So just name what you're seeing, And then the last thing is to ask a gentle question. And the key of this is not a fix-it question, right? This is like not like, so what do you think we can do? Or right? No, this is a question to help understand a little bit better and actually really to help them like start to engage their prefrontal cortex, which is the logic center, and get out of that emotional state. So a question might be like, what is the most upsetting thing to you about this? Or what are you telling yourself right now? What is making you the saddest? Just one question, just one gentle question. Again, you're not fixing it. You're engaging, and you're letting them sort of like, when you engage and they ask a question, they'll start to reflect, and you'll see it'll de-escalate emotion. So in summary, empathy as your friend. Don't feel like you need to solve things. Just, but do show up for them. And empathy is a really powerful way to do that.
I think that is a super helpful way to remind people that these are hard conversations, and that part of your opportunity or role in them are to make the other person seen. And if that's the only thing you accomplished in that performance review, that might actually be the best investment you make. I think when I think about the idea that you can make these the best thing you do all year, if somebody is really struggling to feel like they are being seen, that alone can unlock a huge amount of potential in them. So the performance review cannot carry all the weight that we put on it. And in focusing on how we can manage the conversation and how we can take the opportunity as managers to use this as a really powerful tool, we possibly can't fix all the compensation and all the other things that are going on. But as a manager, we can make people feel seen and heard and important. And that is a huge opportunity, and one that we want to inspire in our managers. I've 1 or 2 questions very specific for Vanesa, but I just wanted to, Lindsey, I mean, you train teams at Stripe, at Superhuman, at PolicyMe, at all these amazing companies. When you think about the kind of number one reason why they're making this investment in their managers, why are people choosing to make that kind of investment? What's sort of the most important thing or outcome that they're looking for when they come to you?
It's a good question. I think the biggest thing they're looking for, I mean, at the end of the day, right? It's like why we started Elevate. At the end of the day, that relationship with your manager is what matters. I mean, it's, there's always that saying, right? People leave managers, not companies. And it's true. And there's tons of research behind it. And so it's just like that relationship is so important. And people genuinely want that relationship to be positive, but not everybody knows how to do that. And so I think that's the problem we're always trying to solve. It's just, or the opportunity we're trying to capture, right? It's just like, how do we make that relationship as meaningful, productive, trusted as possible? Because that is like, that's the unit of change too, where like, that's where you can make so much impact. And then that flows into employee engagement and retention and all these things that are so...
And the trust and psychological safety, right, exactly. All the things we know. Yeah, that's so powerful in that simple idea. And I think this process that we've been talking about is so fraught with the potential to go very poorly if you haven't given your managers the tools over the course of the year, not just for this, but given them the tools and the opportunity to learn how to do it well. But it's also ripe with opportunity because it can be the most inspiring and like a launch pad for everything that's good. So I love
Jocelyn,
that.
Can I tell you why I reached out to Lindsey?
Yeah, well, yes, but then I have one question.
I'll be
to answer.
Super quick, I promise. I think that one thing to remember, especially for the small HR teams, the tiny HR teams, is, I would say I have a lot of knowledge in this space, but building, training takes time. And I think one of the things that's important to remember is we can't do everything by ourselves all of the time. It's just not feasible. So I think for me, one of the things was, how do I find someone that can give me content that I can then use that is content the way that I would write it myself. And I think that's a really great thing about not to just tell you on holiday, but I think, Lindsey and Lucy have done such a good job of just creating really, really valuable content that if you're like me and you want to run it yourself, you can. But if you don't know how to do it, they can actually help you do it. So I think it's interesting. And, they were the right partner for me. There's obviously a ton of partners out there. And this is more to help you guys have access to knowledge, not to tell you who to use as a partner. But it's just, it's one of those things that if I think it's okay to not have all of the time in the world to create the best training that you want to run and to look for a little bit of help somewhere else too. So yeah, back to you. Last question.
No, I'm glad that you brought that around. There are some questions here, or some which we'll have to follow up on, having small teams, getting this stuff started, getting this done. And I think it can be absolutely overwhelming if you're just kicking this process off, if you're just kicking off manager enablement to try and do it all on your own. Even if you are experienced in the space, it's a huge investment to make on something that's so important. So a partnership can accelerate it in a big way. And obviously we believe in giving managers the tools to make those habits stick and to embed them into the flow of work. And when we think about managers, we're at the how can we help them every day do the things they learned. We're not going to teach them how to be empathetic, but we can certainly make sure that they're making space in their day to do that. And that's where we have a lot of alignment with that team as well. So lots of questions, some which I may have to follow up with you on, Vanesa. But one thing that came up twice is this is obviously about your investment in those managers and trusting them and getting and how important they are to you. What are those questions you ask to get feedback on your performance review process?
Yeah, I don't know if you saw, I actually posted them there. That was Jenny, right? She's the one I saw. I don't know if that came through. Right?
Brenda asked it.
I saw. Okay, Jenny.
There we go. She's got the answer right there.
Left, and I was searching them for you as one of them was talking. Those are super simple. At the end of the review process, these are the ones, the way that I went to creating them was, what are the things that matter most to me to know about? And it was of the comms and training, what could have been better? Just let me know, was there anything there that was unclear? Just how did your performance review conversations go? Sometimes people just were it went well. Great, no worries. But if someone needed to be asked, and, it had to be asked right away, I'm glad I have a moment that I've shared it with them. And the last one is actually pretty key, which is if you've discussed learning and career development plans with your team, it's have you talked about next steps type question. And that's the one that a lot of the times I get, oh no, I forgot we had those. What are they again? And it's a great moment for me to send them the link to the page, reach out to me, and we'll help set these up for your team. But it's the way that I've structured it is usually one of them I get a response about by every manager because there's something in one of these three areas that pops up.
Well, I will make sure to include those in the follow-up. As a reminder, you are going to get a recording. You are also going to get access to some courses from the Elevate team. They're going to make those free and available to those of you who attended. And there's a few other follow-ups in there that I will include, some sample one-on-one questions. We have a massive library and a few other things. So last thing I'll do is just ask, we'll put up a poll if there are folks in the audience who would like to hear more about Hypercontext or Elevate or both of us. Just let us know so that we make sure we prioritize getting back to you. For everybody else, thank you so much for attending. Clearly, the three of us could go on for days about this, and please feel free to connect with us on LinkedIn and share your questions. I know Vanessa is a very active participant in LinkedIn. She's a great follow if you're looking for advice, especially those of you who've indicated you're in smaller HR teams. She talks about the real world of being in that operating role, and a huge advice that comes from her. And thanks for joining us. Good luck on your performance reviews. Change your mind about how amazing they could be, because they truly could be the best thing you do all year. And we really appreciate you. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
Thanks, everyone.
Thanks, everybody.